Videos like this are made possible by the generous support of patrons like Lady Lagsalot. Thanks, Lags. Hello, Penguinauts! I'm the Video Penguin, and welcome back to For All Kerbalkind. I was about to say it's been a while, but it hasn't. It's only been 2 weeks. We're back on the 2-week upload schedule, and we should be for the foreseeable future. Now, we're starting the episode by spending 670,000 funds tooling the N1 rocket that we designed in the stream the other day, though we are having to remove the entire lunar complex and the grid fins in order to actually get building this thing, so you don't have all the research. But I wanted to get building it just so we can get this thing launched as soon as possible. We are also tooling some massive separate structure aluminium tanks that we're not actually using, just to make things fair, because we're using these giant prefab parts which don't really cost anything at all, and N9 had to spend like 750,000 funds tooling his Cat 5. So we agreed, okay, I'll tool the type of tank that those prefab parts are. And so we end up spending about 400,000 funds on that. And I think that's fair enough, even though we're using the much more attractive looking prefab parts. Regardless, though, that's going to be in the next episode when we do a test launch and send an uncrewed LK and a lunar rover to the lunar surface, sort of as a backup for if anything goes wrong with our lander, which does indeed have a cosmonaut on board. In the meantime, though, this is Luna 16, and it's going to be taking advantage of the communications network that we constructed around the moon in the previous episode. Yes, this is our first far side lunar lander. Unfortunately, the Americans beat us to this, which I'm a little salty about. Surveyor 1 landed on the moon, the far side of the moon, November 4th, which is less than 2 weeks ago. So yeah, bit of a spit in the LI there, but we're going to try and match that achievement now. Hopefully using a much smaller and cheaper launch vehicle and lander. Now, of course, N9 had to use a single relay satellite and then a throttleable engine. We're going to try and do our usual janky airbag landing, but of course it is going to be on the far side of the moon this time. Just try and do this as cheaply as possible, because these contracts pay pretty well. So if we can do it with the same lunar lander design that we've been using all this time, that would be pretty cool. Of course, we couldn't do this previously because as soon as you go to the far side of the moon, you lose communications. But now we have our network, which is considerably more robust than N9's single satellite in an eccentric orbit. We should be able to do this without any issues whatsoever. Now, we do have some more ambitious lunar missions planned for later in the episode, which is actually something that I was working on, or spent most of the production time of the previous episode working on, and then didn't actually get to show it in the video, but that's why you'll see a whole bunch of UR500s queued up in our build queue if you paid attention while we were at the Space Center. Regardless, we've had a absolutely perfect launch of the R11 Fickle launch vehicle. We've performed our translunar injection, and yeah, this mission goes pretty much perfectly to plan. Although we do have to spend quite a bit of our high-test peroxide monopropellant just adjusting our orbit to get into a nice low orbit of the moon, because we're going to try and do this as efficiently as possible. We're not going to go into an orbit. We are going to slow down, but then we're pretty much going to go straight for a descent around the far side. We're not going for the exact opposite side of the moon, although I don't exactly know the name of our landing site. I'm not great with lunar geography already, let alone far side lunar geography. I'm not aiming for any particular crater because, well, we've got plans for the large specific crater biomes. I just wanted to land in a generic biome on the far side of the moon, and we don't have a huge amount of control over where we land with this lander design. But yeah, obviously the massive craters are very easy to identify, right? So you know you're going to get specific biome science from there. And well, it's going to be important later that we land in specific spots that have different surface compositions. So I don't know the name of this crater that we're landing on the outskirts of. I tried to have a look at lunar far side maps, but I couldn't quite pinpoint where exactly we are landing. But Kerbal engineers suicide burn indicator proving its worth as usual, and we go in for yet another fairly routine at this point landing. Now that we actually have a reliable launch vehicle for these landers, these are pretty reliable. Like, we don't have to worry too much about these kind of missions. And we also have to worry too much about our actual descent profile here. We can, you know, have a few hundred meters per second left when we hit the ground, and it doesn't even matter because airbags are a wonderful thing. I believe the US has prided themselves on only doing powered landings to the lunar surface, but we're getting away with budget missions by landing this way. Unfortunately, we do have the same problem that we had on our last lunar lander, where we break the solar panel though. So we are actually going for a different design on our next far side lander. We're going to have a folding solar panel, which is protected at least until we've righted the probe. It's hopefully going to be protected by the airbags as well, and then only then will it deploy and start catching some rays and generating some electric charge. So hopefully our next lander will last a little bit longer than the 10 or so hours that this lander does last. But regardless, we still get a bunch of scientific data. It's just the longer experiments, the mass spectrometry and the magnetic scan, which unfortunately take 12 to 30 days, I believe. You can see there though, our new communications network is pulling its weight. We're communicating with one of the Lunar 15 satellites, and we transmit some fairly standard images of the lunar surface. Unfortunately though, as I said, we do run out of electric charge, although I didn't land at an opportune time. The sun's just gone down, so we would have run out of the charge anyway. But now I can reveal the mission we've been working on. This is Lunar 17, and it is a sample return mission. Yes, we're finally going to be returning samples from the moon, made possible by the heavy lift capabilities of the UR500, which I've named Yaka. I know in reality it was called Proton, but it was called that after the satellites that it launched. And of course, the famous payload that this rocket launched was the Yaka module of our lunar mission. So I think that's an appropriate name for it. Now, I know what you're thinking. Didn't the Americans already do this with Santa Maria? And you would be half right. They did land a probe on the moon and return it, but they didn't take any surface samples because they didn't have the technology to actually scoop up surface samples yet. I believe they returned data and perhaps some dust on the probe, but they didn't actually return any lunar rocks, and that's what we're going to be doing. At least that's what I wanted to do, but then the third stage engine of the Yaka booster failed and left us 1,000 meters per second short of orbit. And the delta V margins on this mission aren't too tight, but we can't afford to lose a kilometer per second and half the fuel in our translunar injection stage, which, as you can see, is the rather iconic Block Day stage, which is quite a famous stage actually. But yeah, we don't have anywhere near enough fuel to land on the moon, even if we jettison the sample return canister. So we're going to try again a little bit later in the year. In the meantime though, we've unlocked the docking and crew transfer research node, which not only gives us the N1 grid fins, but also gives us access to hydrazine as a monopropellant. The Americans haven't been slacking in the meantime though, as on the 17th of December, they launched the world's first space station. Yes, a permanent settlement in low Earth orbit, created out of a converted K4 upper stage. Although the Gemini 6 mission to rendezvous with it doesn't actually succeed, they are planning another mission to the station early next year. A little bit concerning, but the American crewed program, although this is quite a big leapfrog, is still behind. The Trinity program hasn't even launched yet, and whereas we've been launching Soyuz now for quite a while, so I'd say we still have a pretty firm lead when it comes to crewed spaceflight. You can see here though, Plesetsk is launching their second UR100 Strela booster, which does translate to arrow, but I named it that because Strela is actually a real life rocket, which is a modern derivative of the UR100. So this is doing a little bit of a weird maneuver. As you can see, it's actually launching south, and that's because these things can actually be built way faster than an R12. So we're building them faster than the commercial contracts are being generated. You have to wait 90 days between them, otherwise they don't give you full fund rewards. So I thought we would do one of these weather satellite contracts. And yes, an actual weather satellite, not a spy satellite. So this is Pogoda 10, but this is the first one since, I think, Pogoda 1 that's actually been a weather satellite rather than a spy satellite. The unfortunate thing is though, I accepted the contract and then I was about to launch and then realized, oh, it needs an inclination of lower than 58 degrees. And Plesetsk is at a latitude of 62 degrees, which means that is the minimum inclination it can launch into. So we're doing this dogleg maneuver where we launch south, and then once we're at a low enough latitude, we suddenly do a handbrake turn, power slide, and then sort of power slide our way into orbit, which isn't the most efficient way of doing things, but the UR100 is more than capable enough, particularly because it lifts 1.5 tons into orbit, and that means we have a lot of fuel to play with on this satellite bus. So Pogoda 10 is able to get itself into an orbit. We aren't quite in a low enough inclination, but we still have enough delta V to do an inclination change. I think it's more efficient to do it this way, to do as much of the inclination change as early on as you can, rather than getting into orbit and then trying to do one. That's a lot more expensive. And this might not have been the most efficient way of doing it. I sort of just flew this. I didn't even sim this mission. I'm surprised we even managed to do it. The thing is, though, I've cleared a whole bunch of satellites, all the dead ones from orbit, so we need new communication satellites anyway, so even if the mission had failed, we would have just got an extra comm satellite, so I wouldn't have been too upset about it. But we do manage to successfully hand it off to the customer, and now we're attempting Lunar 17 again. This is Lunar 18, and it's absolutely identical, except this time, hopefully, it won't fail to reach orbit. Now, I was talking about the Block Day upper stage, which did cost about 200,000 funds to tool. I haven't made any iconic upper stages to this point. I haven't really bothered with standardizing upper stages, in fact, because we've pretty much been designing them for each individual mission, and they've just been cylinders with engines attached, right? Because I know there are some pretty famous upper stages in the US, like Centaur and Agena, but in the USSR there aren't really any, and I'm not too bothered about upper stages. Like, I know the rockets are really the iconic thing, but Block Day, you can see it there in all its glory at the top of the rocket, underneath the lander, is actually quite an iconic stage. It was plonked onto Proton rockets and a whole bunch of different launch vehicles. It was used on the N1, in fact, and you will have seen it in the N1 stream. We put it underneath our lunar complex. I believe actually it's part of the lunar complex. It goes right underneath the LK, and it's used for course corrections and then slowing into a lunar orbit after the translunar injection. So it's quite an iconic looking stage. So I decided to spend a few extra thousand funds tooling the iconic shape. Rather than just a plain cylinder, you've got the rather iconic sphere and then toroidal tank underneath it, which does make some sense, because if you store the liquid oxygen in the spherical tank and then the kerosene in the toroidal tank, that means you only have to have insulation on one of the tanks, because only the liquid oxygen boils off. So it does actually reduce the weight of the stage and improves the performance. It's not a balloon tank, they're both integral tanks, but that's more than enough performance for us, because yeah, balloon tanks are expensive as hell, and the entire foundation of the N1 launch system, at least, is to try and be as cheap and low-tech / reliable as possible. But this time, the Yakko booster performs perfectly, and we're inserted into an orbit without having to fire the Block Day engine. Now this mission actually worked out really well, because I designed the entire sample return and everything, attached the Block Day stage, and it just came to exactly 21 tons, which is the payload capacity of the Yakko. So it all worked out rather nicely. You can see here performing our translunar injection with that ever trusty RD-58 engine. Now this mission is happening quite a long time after Santa Maria, as I mentioned earlier, but we had to wait for a lot of different things for this to work. I mean, not only did we need the Yakko booster, which the first one was reserved for the Seva lunar mission, but we also needed the RD-58 upgrade for the S15400 engine, which is powering the Block Day, which otherwise this wouldn't have been possible. We also needed the KTDU-417 engine, which was in the lunar landing tech node, and that's because it's actually our first deeply throttleable engine with loads of relights. The first engine we have which is actually viable for a lunar landing, but it's in the same tech node as the LK lander, so it took a while before we actually had the tech to do that. You see here, we're having to do quite a meaty course correction. That's just because Patch Connix decided it didn't want to work today. Let's just say we had a guidance failure. We couldn't see our encounter with the moon, so we just had to wait till we entered the sphere of influence. A bit irritating when that happens, but thankfully we have enough of a margin on this mission that it shouldn't be an issue. But I'm not taking any chances. I'm burning all our HTP as well, just getting every last meter per second of delta V out of this stage as I can before we detach the lander and we gear up for descent. Now, I'm really glad that we do have a deeply throttleable engine with loads of relights, because for some reason, Kerbal Engineer really doesn't like it. I don't know why, but for some reason our lunar impact time is the only reading that is correct. The suicide burn indicator, delta V, everything is wrong. I think it might be because this is actually technically 2 engines in one. There is the main engine, and then there's actually a pressure-fed engine, which has a lot lower thrust, which I think is supposed to be for the final approach, so that you can actually hover. But for some reason, I think perhaps our probe is a lot heavier than the actual lunar probes that it powered, because for whatever reason, it's not powerful enough to even slow our fall to the lunar surface. So we're just using the main engine the entire way down. So I think perhaps the fact that it is 2 engines in one is what's confusing Kerbal Engineer. But what we're really using here is the time to impact. And then I'm matching that up with the burn time of the engine from MechJeb in the top left. I've been told by Carnasa that I should use MechJeb's landing guidance. Apparently when Kerbal Engineer doesn't work, sometimes the MechJeb one does work a little better. We're not using any landing autopilots though. That is prohibited by our rules. But apparently MechJeb does provide some more accurate suicide burn indicators, so we might use that in future. You can see here though, we're actually aiming for the exact eastern side of the moon. In fact, we're trying to land in Mare Australe, which translates to the Southern Sea. Now, the reason we're doing that is because our sample return canister doesn't actually have control avionics. We had to limit the weight of this sample return as much as possible. So it's actually spin stabilized, so it can only launch directly upwards, which means we need to land along the moon's retrograde vector so we can launch directly upwards and send the sample canister back to the Earth. You see here though, we are slowing and we've managed to null out all of our horizontal velocity quite high above the surface. Not the most efficient way of doing things, but I didn't want to take any chances. We've got a bunch of spare fuel, a bunch of engine relights and a throttleable engine, so I wasn't too worried about it. The fun thing about landing on the eastern side of the moon though is that the Earth is right on the horizon, which is rather beautiful as we begin to touch down in this crater. We're approaching, we're within 1 kilometer of the surface. At this point I was almost shaking, I was so nervous. I've never done this before, actually land on the moon with a throttleable engine. I've always just used the airbags, but we managed to touch down successfully, and Lunar 18 gets a beautiful view of the Earth as it deploys its solar panels and its scientific instruments. So we spent quite a while on the lunar surface just transmitting all of our initial scientific data. This bottom probe is actually going to remain on the lunar surface. It's why it's got solar panels. It should last actually a few years. We probably overbuilt it, but we had a little bit of mass budget to spare since we saved so much by having very limited avionics on the sample return canister. So that's going to stay getting scientific data for a while. But while it's doing that, we're going to send the surface sample back to the Earth. So we adjust the springs in the landing gear just to align it as much as possible so it's launching straight up, and we send the canister back to the Earth. You see it's spin stabilized and just using a simple pressure-fed Caviar B engine. I've had some people complain about the fact we're using Caviar B since it's an American fuel, but I mean, if you're going to be that pedantic about it, maybe don't watch this series or look at any of the jet engines we've been using or the rocket engines we used on the rocket planes in the car program. We don't have all the Soviet engines that perhaps we should have access to. They haven't all been modeled and configured in the game. There are a lot more American engines and fuels and the like. So in order to make things fair, yeah, we use a little bit of American technology. Let's just say in this timeline, Russian scientists invent Caviar B. Is that such a logical leap? I don't think so. Still, we managed to get our trajectory back to the Earth within 50 meters per second left. So we calculated that pretty much flawlessly. And as you see, as soon as we burn through all our fuel, we unlock our avionics. We only had enough control just to slow our spin because we need to be able to actually point the heat shield. And we separate from the launch stage and begin to head back to the Earth. Now we have just enough electric charge stored in our batteries to last the journey, but just in case, I do align ourselves with the retrograde vector, so we should be pointing roughly the right direction. I did try this mission, just spin stabilizing and just launching, but since it's spinning, it obviously doesn't want to change its attitude very quickly, so it gets burnt up by the Earth's atmosphere before it manages to right itself just from the natural aerodynamics of the capsule. So that's why we had to go with some more limited control avionics, which can just control the mass of this sample canister, so we can make sure we're pointing along the retrograde vector, because yeah, lunar returns are pretty rough. And in fact, in all our maneuvering to point along the retrograde vector, we actually raised our periapsis. It should have been below 30 kilometers, and instead it's 60 kilometers. You might think that would lead to a gentler re-entry, and you'd be right with regard to G-forces, but since you're slowing down a lot slower, you're exposed to the high heat for a lot longer, so you actually end up having a much higher overall heat load. And that's not great, because this lunar heat shield has a limited amount of ablator, and we actually burn through all of it. And I was bricking it at this point. I thought we were about to lose the mission, but thankfully, the sample canister itself has its own heat shield, which is only rated for low Earth orbit, but thankfully, the lunar heat shield managed to slow us down to just below Earth orbital velocity. So we cut it close. We cut it really, really close. But we are able to land successfully. Oh, phew. Yeah, we're not going to make that mistake on the next sample return. I can tell you that. I didn't realize that 30 kilometers would make such a difference. But unfortunately, yeah, burnt through all the ablator on that lunar heat shield. So we very, very nearly lost the sample. But just like that, we've landed the world's first lunar rock samples. And we get a lot of science from this mission, not only from the sample, but just for having returned a spacecraft from the surface of the moon. We get 60 science for that, in addition to the 500,000 funds we get for completing the contract. And we've also unlocked mature capsules, which gives us access to the lunar-rated Soyuz. Yes, we finally have all the technology we need to land on the moon. But at the moment, it's taking us about 200 days to build each N1 booster, and we have a whole bunch of preliminary missions and test launches we need to do before we can even attempt that. So it's going to be quite a while yet before we can attempt our first landing. In the meantime, we're launching Svet 22 here, which is just another simple commercial communications satellite. You see, we've got quite a different approach to the Americans. I believe they're investing the same number of points into all of their vehicle assembly building production lines, whereas we're only using the first line to produce N1s, but we're using the other two to continue building other missions and getting as many funds as possible to keep investing them in that line 1 VAB to churn out the boosters. I guess we'll see which approach pays off better, but right now I think we're in the lead. I would actually love some suggestions from you guys in the comments below. What should we name our lunar Soyuz? I don't just want to call it lunar Soyuz, because I know it is just a Soyuz derivative, but I don't want our lunar landing mission to just be called like Soyuz 12 or something like that. We named Zond, Sevier, Yaka. Those are all Soyuz derivatives, and they deserved their own names. So I would love suggestions, preferably in Russian, for what we should actually call our lunar rated Soyuz, because I don't want to just have to keep calling it lunar rated Soyuz. So something in Russian that you think is appropriate, please put your submissions in the comments below, and perhaps I will use one of them. You see here though, Svet 22, bog standard mission. Unlike the previous mission where we had to do a dogleg maneuver, these commercial missions only have to be in an inclination above 44 degrees rather than below 58 degrees, so Plesetsk is the perfect launch site for them. And yeah, we can do these in our sleep. I don't even use the map view. That's how easy and quick these missions are to do, which was another inspiration behind the design of the YAR-100, was just get to orbit as fast as possible so I can fly these missions in a couple of minutes. Just earn us a little bit of money in between the flagship missions like this. This is Lunar 19. We're doing yet another sample return. And this is exactly the same design as Lunar 18. But our next sample return, and there are 3 sample return contracts, will have to be a little bit different, because there are only so many biomes along that eastern side of the lunar surface, and we've already visited one of them, and this is going to visit the other main one. So I think our next lunar sample return is going to have to be a little bit heavier, maybe move some things around, upgrade the upper stage a little bit. I'm not sure how we're going to do it, but we are going to need full control avionics for the sample return so that we can launch from elsewhere on the lunar surface, get a sample from another biome we haven't visited yet. Unfortunately though, this mission has a similar problem to Lunar 17. The engine actually explodes But we're only left 400 meters per second short of orbit rather than the kilometer per second that Luna 17 was. And I very nearly just aborted the mission, but I thought about it, I did a bit of maths, and I thought, actually, I think we might still be able to pull this off. Now, we're going to have to take this right close to the wire and do everything as efficiently as possible. But thankfully, we actually get patched conics this time, which certainly makes it easier to plot our lunar encounter. We are going to attempt this regardless. We're 400 meters per second short, and the last mission landed with 200 meters per second to spare. But I think if we do things a little bit more efficiently, we can still do this. Remember, we spent 100 meters per second just on a course correction maneuver because we didn't have patched conics. And we're going to go directly in for a landing. We're not going to go into orbit first and then orbit around and then begin our descent. No, we're going straight in for a landing, using the block day as part of a suicide burn. And we're still doing this without a working suicide burn indicator. So this is going to be really, really tough. But you know what? I thought we could do it. I did consider jettisoning the sample return canister to give us a few hundred meters per second spare, just to be sure that we could land on the moon. But I was determined, no, I want this to either be a sample return or a lunar impactor. Nothing in between. Because otherwise we're going to have to land on the far side. We've already done all of our lunar landing contracts, our bog standard ones, so there wouldn't really be much point. We get some science from it, but we have a huge stockpile of science at the moment, and in fact we have so much we don't even know what to do with it. I'm leaving it all in the stockpile because until we've researched some of our backlog, I have no idea what I want to be in our research queue. So I'm going to wait till we've researched some techs, a lot of which since we've been beelining for quite late and expensive techs, we'll research in no time at all, and then we'll plan what we're doing with our stockpile of like over 1,000 science. But you can see here, this is our target. We're going to try and land in Mare Smithy. I think it's pronounced Smithy. It translates to Smith's Sea, of course. I said Mare Smithy. I believe it's pronounced Mare because it's Latin, but I have no idea. It means sea anyway, because early astronomers mistakenly thought that the dark patches, which are actually dark basaltic plains created by asteroid impacts, they thought they were actually seas. So that's why they gave them the title Mare. I think it's Mare. I'm sure everyone's going to correct me one way or the other in the comments. So you can see here, yeah, this was a very last minute suicide burn. So late, in fact, that our impact time is a little bit too early. So we have to keep pitching up just a little bit, just slowing our time to impact. And we're trying to keep that impact time as low as possible. So we're, cutting it as efficiently as we can. We're landing slowing down to 0 almost just before we hit the surface, but not so low that we hit the surface before we've slowed down. So we keep changing our pitch and just reducing our vertical velocity, balancing that with slowing our horizontal orbital velocity. And you know what? We managed to do it. I was so proud of this. The fact that without a working suicide burn indicator, we managed to get to the surface within 500 meters. In fact, we managed to slow down within 500 meters of the lunar surface. A much more efficient descent than on Luna 18. And we managed to touch down in Mare Smithy, if that's how it's pronounced. And we take our surface sample. Unfortunately, our celebrations are short-lived as Gemini 7 is launched to the new American space station, and they promptly blow all of Soyuz 1 and 2's mission duration records out of the water. Yes, they've managed to send a crew to their space station far in advance of us launching our own. So let's try and get a bit more good news and return our second lunar surface sample, just to rub some salt in the wound that we returned the world's first lunar rocks from the lunar surface. Prove that it wasn't a fluke. Because as I said, the Americans did return from the moon, but they didn't bring any rocks. And that's the important thing. You gotta bring rocks, or you might as well not have gone at all. And once again, our lunar sample return launch goes off without a hitch. As I said, though, our next one will need full control avionics because we can't keep getting away with just launching directly upwards. Unless we use some weird combination of like timing and spin thrusters to try and like orient ourselves to a certain angle. I think it'd be easier just to have control avionics. We do already have control avionics, just they can't control a high enough tonnage to actually control the entire stage. It's once it's burnt out, only then can it spin down and then control its attitude so we can orient our heat shield. But yeah, we're not planning to launch any space stations for a really long time. We're not even researching any of the space station tech nodes or anything that we need to do that. I believe we're need to research early space stations. There's prototype and then early before we get access to any of the Salyut stations. And now the Americans have beat us to it, I'm not really in any rush. I think our first space station will be a Salyut. Either that or we'll do the Soyuz gunship concept. It was called Zvezda, not to be confused with Zvezda, the moon-based concept, or Zvezda, the ISS module, but there was a Soyuz derivative called Zvezda, which would have been similar to the Gemini manned orbiting laboratory program, where it had its descent module at the top, and then a hole in the heat shield, and then the lab beneath, and it would have been used similar to how the Almaz stations were used, as basically as a spy satellite, but it also would have had a cannon on the front of it, similar to how one of the Almaz stations did as well. So I think that'd be pretty cool, like a military Soyuz. Instead of a cannon, we'd probably strap a space torpedo to it or something. But let me know if you'd be interested in me doing that. I think that could be a lot of fun. Still, our mission is a complete success, and we return the second lunar rock samples, and we also get a little view of one of the trains delivering some supplies to our horizontal assembly building, which is almost finished constructing our first N1. We also spend 500,000 funds unlocking the launch escape system. That's obviously quite a lot, but I was happy to spend that much funding sort of to crew rate the N1, if that makes sense, because N9 is set to spend a lot more on the Apollo program and the Saturn V than we have. Some of our parts, and particularly the lunar Soyuz and stuff, since it is a derivative of the low Earth orbit Soyuz, they don't really cost much whatsoever, and some of them aren't costed properly. So we spent a lot of extra funds this episode just to make sure that things are fair. But that is the end of the episode. Thank you very, very much for watching. Please get those submissions in the comments below for names that you think might be appropriate for our upcoming lunar Soyuz. We'll be launching the N1 for the first time in the next episode. I hope you're as excited for that as I am. We're sending, as I said, an uncrewed LK and a lunar rover, which is capable of carrying a cosmonaut to the lunar surface. This is something that was actually planned, sort of as a backup in case anything went wrong. And it also means that if something with the main engine of the LK goes wrong on descent, we can use the backup engine, still land, and then we can go get in the rover, go over to the backup LK, and then take off. I believe they would have also used them as like radar beacons to have a more accurate view of their altitude above the lunar surface. But as I said, that'll all be in future episodes. Also, I've now put the For All Kerbalkind save files, craft files, and a detailed installation guide, plus all the patches and extra little mods you've seen, like the spacesuits, the Soviet spacesuits, the Orlan and Kretschit, and also the earlier ones for Voskhod and Vostok, as well as the little prop guns like the TP-82 and everything. They're all on my Patreon now. They're in the lowest tier, so it can all be yours for the low, low cost of £1. So link in the description and the end screen if you're interested. Thanks for watching, everyone. I do hope you've enjoyed, and I'll see you in 2 weeks. A massive thank you to my patrons and donators for their generous support. And an extra special thank you to the Amazing Steak, Olaf Hammerhand, Lady Lagsalot, Dakota Clark, Madzor, Peter Lushtinets, Dennis Klomp, Lightning Gamer, Simone67, Scott Milligan, Jesse Smith, Elmac, and NX74656.